Good evening and welcome to Know Your Rights. This is the show where you hear directly from lawyers who break down the law and explain the rights of citizens on common legal issues that confront Belizeans on a regular basis. Tonight, we will be discussing constitutional law and its importance in our legal system, in addition to ensuring the protection of every citizen in our country. Joining us to shed light on this significant topic is attorney Darrell Bradley from the law firm of Bradley, Ellis and Company. Good evening and welcome, Darrell.
It's a pleasure being here and thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. I'm sure it's a bit refreshing to be in an interview in the capacity of your profession as an attorney and not as the mayor, maybe for once, for a while.
Refreshing. I feel a little bit more at ease.
That's good, that's good. I'm sure you'll be very helpful at bringing the issue to us. And first, we want to start very basic. What is constitutional law?
Well, basically, constitutional law is the law of the Constitution. And the Constitution is a written document. It's considered the first law of Belize. It's the supreme law of Belize, so that the Constitution actually says that this law is the supreme law of the land, and any law that is in contravention to this law is void to the extent of the inconsistency. So that what the Constitution does, it does three things. It establishes the country of Belize, so that the Constitution actually says there shall be a country known as Belize, and it talks about the boundaries and so forth. It then establishes all institutions and offices of government, so that it will say there shall be a governor general, there shall be a prime minister, there shall be a leader of the opposition, there's a cabinet, there's a chief justice, so that all the institutions and offices of government, the Constitution would set out those, and it would give them power, so that it would establish and say what those entities are authorized to do. And the third very fundamental thing that the Constitution does is that it creates a certain a series of Bill of Rights, so that it gives every single person a series of rights which are enforceable against the government. You have the right to life, you have the right to freedom of association, freedom of religion, the right to private property, and so forth.
So I want to come to the second item that you listed, which is the institutions. So basically, it gives the structure of the governance of our country.
Yes. Well, the Constitution would outline everything, and it would be basically the fundamental aspects, so that the Constitution would say that Belize is a democratic state, it's a constitutional monarchy, it establishes and mentions the Governor General as Her Majesty's representative. It says that there shall be a Prime Minister, and it says how the Prime Minister is established and obtains office. It says that there shall be members of the House of Assembly and a Senate, so that every single main office in Belize is established by the Constitution, and the Constitution would be the source of those individuals' powers.
As well as it gives its duties, its authority, its power, but also how they interrelate with each other as well, and basically coexist, these institutions.
Of course, that's a fundamental and an excellent question. That one of the things which is interesting in constitutional law is the structure of the Constitution, that it's separated into parts, and these parts interrelate. That's interpreted to reflect the interrelationship between the various structures of government, so that you would have the executive branch of government, the legislative branch of government, and the judiciary. And each of these sections are established as part of the Constitution, and each of these act as a check and balance on the other parts. So that one of the things that the Constitution establishes is this idea of limited government. And when constitutions became very dominant after you had a period of revolutions in Europe, the idea was that you wanted to put a check on the autocratic power of government. At that time, you had very strong monarchies, and you had the French Revolution where they cut off the king's head and the queen's head. And the idea was that you would put a written text that would create certain rights that limit the government, so that individuals' power in society would actually be emphasized as against the state.
So in those structures, the administration was basically, what would I say, then I'm a judge, jury, then I'm everything.
Yeah.
But now in our structure, we're seeing, and I go back to my social studies days in a primary school, the separation of power, and that is outlined in the Constitution. Now, you spoke on the 3 institutions. I'd just like you to repeat them and give the people a basic overview of what each institution is responsible for in that sense.
Well, you have, first of all, the executive branch of government, and the executive branch would be made up of the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and the Ministers of Government, and those would be persons who would be responsible for the execution and the implementation of government policy, so that those would be better understood as the administrators of government or the apparatus, so that a minister of government would be an individual who would have a portfolio and they would be responsible for a programmatic element of government. For example, you'd have the Minister of Tourism. They're responsible for developing tourism as an economic engine for Belize. You have the Minister of Education, you have the Minister of Culture, you have the Minister of Transportation. So that would be the programmatic element. You have then the legislative part of government, and this would be the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they would be responsible for the passage of legislation, so that they do not really have an operational or a programmatic function. Their function would be to convene, as oftentimes as the Prime Minister convenes the Parliament, and they would debate bills, so that you would have the government and you would have the opposition representatives, and it is just a back and forth in relation to how do we determine what pieces of legislation are important for the country to operate under. And then the 3rd branch of government is the judiciary, and that is established as an independent branch of government, and it's very fundamental that the judiciary be independent, because the judiciary is that branch of government that the citizen can turn to if they are aggrieved by any action of the executive or the legislature. So that if I feel that the Prime Minister does something, or if I feel that the government does something, I can go to the judiciary, and the judiciary can act as a check and balance on any action of the government. And I can actually sue the government. That's something that the Constitution establishes. So the Constitution operates as a litmus test or a benchmark, so that fundamentally it creates this principle of the rule of law, and that's very, very important for constitutional law. And it means that we have a system of rule of law rather than rule by men and women. So it's not that the Prime Minister rules the country, it's that the law rules the country, and any citizen who is aggrieved can seek redress through the courts, so that the courts can act as a check and balance on the executive authority.
So what type of, I want to say, I'm not sure if I'm using the proper terms, or what, but what comes under the constitutional laws? What areas does it cover?
Well, the Constitution covers all areas of law, so that fundamentally I think constitutional law is very important when you deal with criminal law, because if you look at what a trial is, and if you look at the certain principles, for example, the right of due process, what the state is trying to do is that the state is trying to take away your freedom if you are somebody who was arrested, and the state ultimately can have you executed, although we have never done that in recent memory. So that what the Constitution does is that the Constitution, it's very active and alive in areas where you see due process being enshrined. So that if I want to charge you with a crime, there's certain procedures that I must follow. I must read you your rights, so to speak. I must advise you that you can seek counsel. If I detain you, I can only detain you for 48 hours. I must take you before a magistrate so that you can get bail. All of these are practical ways that you see the Constitution working, so that we may think the Constitution is a dusty document on somebody's shelf, but it's actually a very fundamental piece of legislation that is all around us. We may not necessarily experience it, but it's all around us. And you mainly see it in the area of criminal law, because that's the whole idea of a trial, is that the state must prove you prove you guilty, because the Constitution says that there's a presumption of innocence. If I want to take away your liberty or your freedom, I cannot do that arbitrarily. I must follow a certain process, and that's enshrined in the Constitution.
And there's a word you keep mentioning that I want us to emphasize, which is state, but we have to take a commercial break. So hold it.
I could go out and out.
Hold it. We'll be right back after this short break, continuing our discussion on constitutional law. Welcome back to Know Your Rights. I am Khadija Usher, and our guest tonight is attorney Darrell Bradley, and we are discussing constitutional law and its importance in our legal system, as well as ensuring the protection of every Belizean citizen. So I cut you, but you made a point that I wanted to clarify, and you kept mentioning the state. An individual feel aggrieved against the state. So the constitutional law, it deals specifically the relationship between individual and state?
Yes, that's the fundamental point, and you make an excellent summary of what it deals with. So that previous to written constitutions, you had this idea of autocratic leadership, that governments and states really exerted a significant amount of control over individuals. You even see that in countries today. China, which is a communist state, in Cuba, in other states within our region. And when you are a democracy, the citizens' power is exemplified, and the Constitution serves as a fetter or a limitation on the power of government. That's why they have the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are enforceable rights against the government, so that when it says that you have a freedom of association, when it says that you have a freedom of religion or a right to life or so forth, these rights are actually enforceable against the government or against the state, because that's usually the entity that would aggrieve your rights. So that when I would arrest you, there are certain things that a police officer, as an agent of the state, that person must do to ensure that your constitutional rights are protected. In the modern era, in terms of constitutional law, this has actually expanded significantly to the point where now the state must protect your rights against third parties. So that this is an area of growth in constitutional law where you have this idea of bullying in schools. You have different issues which you may not necessarily think of it being constitutional law, but the governmental entities must ensure that you are protected in whichever environment you are. And you can see this in practical ways, but as you say, it's really balancing the rights of an individual against the state.
And maybe we might not see those aspects as much here yet, but we do see the international crackdown from the international organizations, especially through the media, in terms of bullying and so. But is it that every time you're going to court, you're going with a claim on the basis of constitutional law? Or is it that the basis of your claim can be on another era?
No, well, of course, when somebody goes to court, they can sue on every area of law. So that constitutional law is, I would think, a dominant feature of law. It's the most important source of law. But you have many subsets of law. For example, you'd have employment law, you'd have criminal law, you would have family law, you would have company law. So that when you contract law, property law, succession law, so that people may bring a claim in any area of law. But in many cases, and especially in dominant areas, for example, criminal law, it touches on constitutional rights. These are not things which may be very obvious, but underpinning all areas of law is the Constitution itself. The basic right that a person can bring a claim against another individual or against a government, that's enshrined in the Constitution because the court structure is created by the Constitution.
Make a throw out a scenario for you, because I like play devil's advocate in a way, right? Belizean walking down the street. They walk down the sidewalk now. A pretty young lady, right? Young lady walking on the sidewalk, dropping our manhole. We're not to say why the manhole that we're not nothing, not you, Mayor, but you know, dropping a manhole, hurt up the face. Let's go say the lady profession, either a model or something. Now they're out of work, and so she going after the state. Is she going after then on the basis of constitutional law? Would it be?
No, but you would go after the state and this is municipal government because this is a city council responsibility, but you would go after the state for negligence. And negligence is an area of law which falls under what we call tort law. And certain entities have a duty of care, and the municipal government would have a duty of care with respect to the physical infrastructure of the city. So that wouldn't necessarily be a constitutional law case, it would be a negligence. But there are certain governmental responsibilities which a government, including a municipal government, owes a citizen, like the maintenance of the physical infrastructure. And if that person is damaged, that person can bring a claim against that. So you can recover, and oftentimes when people bring those kinds of cases, we try to settle it because we are liable to a great extent.
Never made it specifically through something, just a scenario. No, I want to throw another one though. You are arrested and you're on remand in jail 10 years. I believe was actually a case. You come and after the 10 years, I think you mentioned it earlier, we have a system, innocent until proven guilty. Not yet proven guilty by the state. 10 years you're out of jail. You want to felt that your law violated. Would it be on a basis of constitutional law?
That's an excellent question as well. I don't do a lot of criminal law, but I have a case that I'm doing right now where the individual is incarcerated on remand on murder charges for 9 years. He's the second longest person who is on remand, and it would be my opinion that that would be a fundamental violation of that person's constitutional rights. The way that that person would seek redress would be by bail, so that when a person is charged, a person is, by the Constitution, it actually says that if you are not tried within a reasonable time, a person shall be entitled to bail, because bail secures your liberty while the state gets its act together. The problem is what the court interprets what a reasonable time is. So we've applied in this case for bail for this individual twice. And the courts will say that we have a shortage of judges, we have a backlog of cases, we have a problem with evidence, and so forth, so that it surprises me that an individual in a democratic state can be on remand for 9 years. To me, that is unacceptable, and it's really something that's very sad. But when you interpret the Constitution, you interpret it in a way, and I would say the word would be balance, so that the Constitution actually says that individuals have certain fundamental rights, but these rights must be balanced against the interests of the state and against the rights of each other. So that you may look at this from the point of view of an individual being incarcerated for so long, but one of the societal interests is that Belize has a very high crime rate. So that there is a public interest in not wanting individuals who are charged with very serious offenses to be roaming on the street. So that one of the things in my argument would be that you would always balance the Constitution on the right of the individual versus the right of the state or other considerations. But this idea of balance is a very powerful theme in the Constitution, because you have policy considerations which a judge looks at when applying constitutional rights. And one of the things where they would sometimes bend in favor of the government is looking at certain realities, like the fact that we have a crime situation. So that I would think that there's a certain skewing there.
Okay. And in terms of you feel aggrieved and the remedies, what is the procedure that you go through?
Well, if you feel aggrieved by any issue, then you could commence a claim in the Supreme Court and you would sue any entity. More than likely, the entity that you would sue is the government, because again, this idea of the relationship between an individual against the state. So that you've had cases where people have sued the government because there was one interesting case, I won't say the name of the case, but an individual violated an ordinance which prohibited the building of a fence over a certain height. And the individual said that you are violating my constitutional rights because you can't block down my fence, Mr. Government. And even though my fence is higher than the permitted allowance, I could point to 10 other people who have the same infraction. So the idea with constitutional law is that one of the principles of this rule of law is that the law must be applied equally. You can't just come break down my fence and not enforce the law against these 10 other persons. You've had other cases where for example, the case of the sodomy laws, so that one of the rights that the Constitution enshrines is this right to self-determination, that an individual should be able, as long as it does not adversely affect the public interest or societal considerations, an individual should be able to define their personal identity. That's a very fundamental right in the Constitution. So you would see that in the case of the sodomy laws. You also see that in the case of recognizing Mayan traditional land rights. So that this idea of self-determination is a powerful concept, that an individual should be able to be the architect of their own identity in whatever ways, my cultural expression, my personal expression, and that a person should not be discriminated against, and whatever laws are applied must be applied universally across all spheres.
Yes, your example really to help we get this idea of the understanding of the balance concept that you brought out. But we have to take one more short break, and then we will be right back to continue our discussion on constitutional law. Welcome back to Know Your Rights. I am Khadija Usher, and our guest tonight is attorney Darrell Bradley, and we are discussing constitutional law and its importance in our legal system, as well as ensuring the protection of every Belizean citizen. So for our final segment, I want to go more into the Bill of Rights. Okay. You mentioned that to be as one of the subheadings under the constitutional law. Can you give us a bit more explanation on the Bill of Rights? What's covered?
Well, the Bill of Rights is intended to create a certain quality of life for individuals, and these are enforceable rights. So if your rights are violated, you can bring a claim in the Supreme Court against any entity that violates your rights. So the most basic right is the right to life, that you have a right to life, and you also have a right to what we call bodily integrity. Nobody can harass you, detain you, do whatever. You have a right to liberty, you have a right to freedom of association, you have a right to freedom of conscience, you have a right to freedom of religion, you have a right to freedom of expression, so that you can say what you want. And these are very fundamental things, so that the Constitution protects, for example, the right of free speech, the right of media entities to go and criticize government. I am very familiar with this because you have media persons who are on the radio all day and they go and they bash this politician, this, and but you have those fundamental rights according to the Constitution, which is not the case for a non-Western democratic society. If you speak out against the government in certain societies, you would be jailed. But the Constitution actually protects those rights. You also have some more very basic rights, the right to private property, for example. So the government can't take your land except with reasonable compensation. People saw this when the government acquired BTL. The government had to pay compensation for that. That's a constitutional right. You also have certain other rights, so that you can't be detained except with bail. I mentioned earlier, if you have a right to a fair trial within a reasonable period of time. The problem is what the courts consider reasonable. You have a right not to be subjected to cruel and inhumane punishment. At one time, if you were charged with a certain offense, the police used to beat you with a katana. You can't do that anymore, because that would be in violation
You said
of your
one time and I laughed, but continue though.
No, but you can't, because that would be considered cruel and inhumane. There's certain debates right now. If the death penalty, for example, is considered cruel and inhumane, and so this would be one of the reasons why we don't really execute persons to the way that we did in the past. So that these basic fundamental rights, it is meant to create a certain quality of life for individuals, so that these things should be enjoyed by every single person who's within the jurisdiction of Belize, and the government has a responsibility to enforce these rights in favor of individuals. And
you said every single person. Earlier you mentioned equality under the law, no matter gender, no matter creed, no matter whatever. We got a question. If you are a non-religious believer, but you are mistreated from living in a religious country. You said that we're on the western side. It's a bit different. But if you're mistreated because of living in a religious country, how does constitutional law play in that?
You can actually sue. So that there was a case previously where an individual, again, I won't mention the name, but her employer, which was a religious educational management, fired her because she became pregnant and unmarried. And this was because of their religious indoctrination. Yes. Of course, a religious school would speak of abstinence and certain values and so forth, but she sued and the court awarded $150,000 in damages. So that's how the Constitution will work. That you can say, and one of the arguments in that case, when I teach constitutional law, I actually use it quite extensively, was that if you apply a policy, the policy must apply to everybody so that you don't enforce that law against men who impregnate women. In that case, the management showed that they did it for 3 persons. 3 men that they enforced that policy against, but the court felt that it was not sufficient, that this is something that blatantly would discriminate against women because only women can become pregnant. And that's how the Constitution would be very practical in its operations. But you have a freedom of conscience so that I can be of whatever religion that I want. I can be a Christian, I can be a Muslim, I can be a Jew, or I can be of no religion. One of the things that I oftentimes hear is that you would go into maybe a Catholic school or an Anglican school or a Baptist school, and you don't want to go to confession, or you don't want, the school by law should not force you to do that, because that violates your constitutional rights.
Okay. And so for a final question, and this might be a little bit difficult because it's a comprehensive topic, but what do you really want to emphasize to the public on constitutional law?
Well, I think this idea of public awareness. The Constitution establishes a certain form of government, but the Constitution itself is only a document. So that there's this thing that's often said that a right unasserted does not exist. So that if you do not make the Constitution a living, breathing document by your ability to challenge government authority, you encourage a system of autocracy. You encourage the kind of tyranny that the Constitution was specifically intended to prevent. So that the Constitution gives you certain rights, but you should defend those rights and you should stand up for those rights. And so one of the things that I appreciate this opportunity to be on the show is that you're raising very fundamental questions about something that people don't really recognize. So that if you suffer injustice, like you are at the end of detention order in court, or something happens to you, it's your right to live in a certain society that affords every individual freedom, and that's a fundamental thing, but we must challenge authority more.
And we only could challenge it if we know it. And that's
true.
So that's why people have to keep watching, right? But unfortunately, we have come to the end of our show for tonight. Thank you, Darrell, for joining us and providing important information on tonight's topic. Next week, we will be joined by attorney Steve Pereira, who will address our rights and responsibilities when it comes to car and motor vehicle accidents. Tonight's episode of Know Your Rights repeats at 1 p.m. on Sunday on Channel 7, and it will also be available for your viewing on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you for watching, and good night.